We are live. Hello and welcome everyone to today's live stream. This is the 12th day in a row, 12 out of 26, so we're almost halfway done. Tomorrow will be the halfway point once we finish tomorrow's live stream. And today we're going to be talking about the sectional crisis. This chapter, as you can see, we have our very own chapter page on our website, which you can follow along. I put the link in the description, but if you want me to say it, it's www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled Tarpeia.us, and this is chapter 12 of the compendium. This is the first chapter in the Emancipation era, not to be confused with the antebellum era, which that antebellum era ends with the Mexican-American War. Sectional crisis will begin in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. And so the Emancipation era will begin and will end with the end of Reconstruction. And so this chapter covers the years 1849 to 1860. And this chapter is divided into 3 sections. The first of these is called Condemned Compromise from 1849 to 1853. And each section has its own interactive timeline, like what you see here. And what's in the timeline are a bunch of primary source documents and events to give context to what's going on during this time period. And then the next section will be Bleeding Kansas from 1853 to 1857, and this will cover the Pierce administration. And then the third and final section of this chapter is called A House Divided, 1857-1860, which will cover the Buchanan administration, although it does not completely end with the Buchanan administration. It will end a couple months before the Buchanan administration ends with the election of 1860. So let's begin with the first section, Condemned Compromise. Sectional tensions over slavery in the territories and the return of fugitive slaves culminated in the Compromise of 1850, admitting California as a free state, organizing Utah and New Mexico under popular sovereignty, abolishing the slave trade in Washington, D.C., settling Texas's boundaries, and enacting a far harsher Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act quickly became the defining wedge issue of the era, provoking open resistance in the North, and as anti-slavery sentiment increasingly became part of its political culture. The period also marked the end of an old political order with the deaths of the triumvirate, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster. As the old generation passed, a new generation of increasingly uncompromising leaders emerged in Congress. Charles Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens, Benjamin Wade, and James Blaine became prominent voices for free labor and opposition to the expansion of slavery, while Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stephens, Robert Toombs, William Yancey, and James Hammond will champion slavery, white supremacy, and the doctrine that human bondage formed the cornerstone of Southern civilization. And so the very first document that we include is Zachary Taylor's inaugural address. This was given on March 5th, 1849. He pledged to act as a nonpartisan president above factional politics, promising to uphold the separation of powers and the will of the people as expressed through Congress. Taylor emphasized his reverence for the Constitution as the safeguard of liberty, vowing never to exercise powers not granted by it, and declaring that his faith in the union of these states as the foundation of America's prosperity. On foreign affairs, he affirmed a commitment to peace and honorable diplomacy while also signaling the need for readiness to defend the nation if threatened. Domestically, he called for justice, moderation, and adherence to law, while deliberately avoiding the explosive slavery question, reflecting both his desire to calm sectional tensions and his lack of a defined political program, at least at the start of his administration. Pretty early on, the Taylor administration, you have Henry Box Brown escapes. Brown mails himself in a wooden box from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, securing his freedom after a 27-hour in transit. After 27 hours in transit, and he would later tour the North, giving lectures and dramatic reenactments of his escape. And his story becomes one of the most sensational and widely publicized of the era. The former president, James Polk, dies. Let's see. Taylor's address against violence in Cuba. Zachary Taylor issued a proclamation warning American citizens against participating in an unlawful expedition to Cuba, declaring that such filibustering violated the neutrality laws of the United States and its obligations under international law. The planned invasion, organized by Narciso Lopez and supported by American volunteers, was condemned by Taylor, who directed federal authorities to prevent the expedition in order to preserve American honor and avoid war with the Spanish Empire. Harriet Tubman will make her escape in September of 1849, and she will later be a major contributor to the Underground Railroad, freeing around 70 slaves, including her own family members, and then she will work with the Union as a spy during the Civil War. You have the Constitution of California, which is 1849. Delegates to the California's Constitutional Convention adopted the Constitution of California, declaring that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, unless for the punishment of crimes, shall ever be tolerated in this state. By prohibiting slavery before statehood, California positioned itself for admission as a free state, intensifying the sectional conflict that led to the Compromise of 1850. So you have to keep in mind the current compromise, which everyone has been following up to this point, is the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So 30 years prior, or for the past 30 years, there's been this system of states above the 49th parallel will become free, states below will become a slave. California is both above and below, and they decide for the entire state, the people of California decide for the entire state to be free, which violates the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And so this will bring into question how are we going to resolve it if we can't rely on the previous compromise? We're going to have to create a new compromise, which will be the Compromise of 1850. And you'll see what that will include in a minute. Taylor's 1849 State of the Union address, where this is his first annual message to Congress, and he emphasized his commitment to preserving the Union, urging moderation in the debate over slavery in the newly acquired Mexican territories while deferring to Congress on sectional disputes. He also promoted sound finances, respect for Native American treaties, infrastructure improvements, and a firm but peaceful foreign policy that rejected filibustering ventures like the Cuban expedition. Now, you have to keep in mind, this is just what the president was saying, not necessarily what the president was doing. He spoke out against the Cuban expeditions of Narciso Lopez. He will not be able to stop it. He spoke out in favor of respecting Native American treaties. That does not mean that America or Americans will continue to respect those treaties. Same thing with finances. Just because he talks about just because he talks about sound finance does not mean that sound finance has actually been achieved in the country. So you have to keep an open mind whenever a president gives a State of the Union address to be critical enough to know whether or not what he's saying is actually true, like actually being implemented in the real world, actually followed, or if it's just his aspirations and ideals. So you have to separate what people idealize versus reality. And I think that's part of what being a historian is about, is realizing what, that separation of the ideal, what people talk about, what people think they're achieving versus what they're actually achieving. So Taylor's message on admitting New Mexico and California. He urged the immediate admission of California and New Mexico as states rather than territories, arguing this would bypass divisive debates over slavery in the new lands won from Mexico. His position angered many Southern leaders who feared losing political balance in Congress and helped intensify the sectional crisis that soon followed. And so, following Taylor's message, in response to it, Senator Henry Clay will propose what would become the 1850 Compromise. And so, responding to President Taylor's call for the immediate admission of California and New Mexico by proposing a broader package of measures, later known as the Compromise of 1850, aimed at balancing sectional interests. Clay's plan sought to admit California as a free state, organize New Mexico and Utah without restrictions on slavery, settle Texas boundary disputes, abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and enact a stronger fugitive slave law to appease the South. So, every single point of what Henry Clay is proposing will become the main bills of the Compromise of 1850. Other members of Congress will put in their 2 cents, and we're trying to include as many of these speeches by members of Congress as we can. And so we have on the subject of slavery in the territories, parts 1 and 2 by Jefferson Davis. So Davis argued that the Western territories were the common property of all the states and that citizens had an equal constitutional right to settle there with their property, including enslaved people. He rejected congressional authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, contended that such restrictions violated the constitutional equality of the states and the property rights of Southern citizens. Davis further maintained that the federal government had a duty to protect slave property in the territories rather than exclude it, making the issue a test of whether the constitutional compact between the states would be faithfully upheld. And then part 2, he expanded upon his constitutional arguments from the previous day. Davis asserted that the Union was founded upon the equal sovereignty of the states and that Congress possessed no authority to discriminate against Southern property in the territories. He wanted that excluding slavery from the common territories would destroy the constitutional balance between the sections, weaken the rights of the slaveholding states, and threaten the permanence of the Union. Davis concluded by insisting that that any lasting settlement of the sectional crisis required full recognition of Southern constitutional rights rather than the legislative compromises that favored one section over another. So you have differences of opinion, and these differences will solidify in different sections of the country, not just between the North and the South, but within the parties themselves, the Whigs and the Democrats. Here is John C. Calhoun pitching in his own opinion, the causes by which the Union is endangered. This was made on March 4th, 1850. So Senator John C. Calhoun's final speech before he dies, the causes by which the Union is endangered, warned that the growing dominance of the North and restrictions on slavery threatened to dissolve the Union. Too ill to deliver it himself, his speech was read aloud in the Senate, insisting that only by granting the South equal rights in the territories and stronger protections for slavery could disunion be averted. And so this is the very last speech that John C. Calhoun will give. He doesn't give it himself, and it's to the Senate. And he is just getting so many things wrong. All of these people saying that the federal government did not have a right to outlaw slavery or restrict slavery in the territories. They should have read their history books, because one of the very first things that our nation did following the War for Independence and before our own Constitution was ratified was pass the Northwest Ordinance. That was passed during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And one of the things that the Northwest Compromise did was it outlawed slavery in the Northwest Territories, or at least it restricted it heavily. And so the idea that these who will be Confederate leaders, like Jefferson Davis, or who would have been Confederate leaders, probably, like John C. Calhoun, if he didn't die, they're arguing that the Constitution did not give the federal government the right to restrict slavery in the territories. That's just false by looking at history of the federal government restricting slavery in the territories since before our Constitution was even ratified. And so, I think historically this proves that the Southern cause, at least that particular argument, to be false, even though Southerners at this time, the pro-slavery advocates, the fire eaters, will use that as one of their main arguments. It's like, oh, the Constitution does not give the federal government the right to restrict slavery. Well, it does. In fact, the Constitution has to actively protect slavery for a limited amount of time, because they knew and they understood that the Constitution gave the federal government the right to restrict slavery, especially the slave trade. And although the importation of slavery would take 20 years from the ratification of the Constitution till its abolition in 1808 during the Jefferson administration, the exportation of slavery was restricted earlier during the Washington administration. And so the idea of the federal government restricting slavery was very much well accepted by the founders, by the framers of the Constitution, by the founding presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson himself, slave owner, Washington was a slave owner, Madison as well. And so, yeah, I think the idea that the federal government was not granted the right to restrict slavery is a false idea, just looking at history. So you have this speech by Daniel Webster, March 7th, 1850, urging compromise to preserve the Union, arguing that slavery was unlikely to expand into the arid territories of the Mexican Cession. While appealing to Northern moderates, his call for the fugitive slave law strict enforcement alienated many abolitionists, costing him political support in New England. So right off the bat, before the fugitive law is even passed, this is causing problems, especially for Northerners, and particularly New Englanders. You have a speech by William Seward, Freedom in the New Territories, and in the speech to the Senate, he argued against extending slavery into the Western territories. Seward rejected compromise measures that would allow slavery's expansion, declaring that a higher law of morality and justice stood above human statutes, protecting slavery. The speech made Seward one of the leading voices of the anti-slavery movement in Congress. So, again, right off the bat, the compromise is not looking too compromising. Or maybe it's compromising too much. It's compromising the integrity of the North while also appealing too much to Southern pro-slavery interests. And so we'll see how this goes. John C. Calhoun will die on March 31st, 1850. So he dies before the compromise is enacted. You have the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, negotiated between the United States and Great Britain, pledged that neither nation would seek exclusive control over any future canal across Central America. Intended to ease tensions and secure cooperation, the treaty temporarily balanced Anglo-American interests, but later became a source of dispute as U.S. expansionist ambitions grew. So even all the way back in 1850, there were talks of a canal being built. Of course, it wouldn't be built for another 50 plus years. Taylor's message to Congress on Cuba, opposing the annexation of Cuba, warning that such a move would provoke war with Spain and inflame sectional tensions over slavery. Taylor emphasized adherence to international law and U.S. neutrality, discouraging filibustering expeditions like those led by Narciso Lopez. You have the Nashville Convention, which brought together delegates from 9 southern slave-holding states to coordinate a response to the growing sectional crisis over slavery in the territories. Led by Southern fire eaters, the convention condemned proposals restricting slavery's expansion and warned that the South should consider secession if Congress adopted unacceptable measures. Although some delegates favored immediate disunion, moderates prevailed, and the convention instead called for equal rights for slaveholders in the territories while postponing more drastic action. So you'll see that as we get closer to the Civil War, you'll start to notice that the causes of the Civil War was not actually the South defending slavery. It was the South trying to expand slavery, expand it into places it hadn't been before, into the new territories, into all new states, into all current states with the Fugitive Slave Act, and then later, you'll see, with the Dred Scott decision. For the 4th of July of 1850, the Taylor will celebrate at the Washington Monument, which is still being built, and he will consume milk and vegetables, which will cause an illness, a gastrointestinal illness, and this will lead to his death, sadly. So this is just the treaty being ratified. Taylor dies of gastroenteritis, and most likely from the food that he ate on the 4th of July. Milk and vegetables apparently is not healthy for you. And so Fillmore will swear in as president, and Fillmore will give an address on the Texas situation, urging resolution of the Texas boundary and debt disputes with the federal government. His proposal supported a compromise that would honor Texas's territorial claims while ceding some land to the federal government in exchange for debt relief, helping pave the way for the broader compromise of 1850. So now we have the actual compromise itself. And so the first acts of the compromise were passed on September 9th, 1850, and the first was to establish the territorial government of New Mexico, leaving the slavery question up for the people to decide, which is a policy called popular sovereignty. You have the admission of California as a free state. You have the act to establish a territorial government for Utah, again following popular sovereignty. Now you have the infamous Fugitive Slave Act. The act strengthened federal government enforcement of the constitutional requirement that escaped enslaved people be returned to their enslavers by creating a system of federally appointed commissioners empowered to issue warrants and authorize the capture and return of alleged fugitives. It required federal marshals and even private citizens to assist in the apprehension of escapees, imposed penalties on those who aided fugitives, and denied alleged fugitives many legal protections, including the right to testify in their own defense. The law intensified sectional tensions by expanding federal protection of slavery into the free states, provoking widespread resistance from abolitionists and many northern communities, while becoming one of the most controversial measures of the compromise. That is an understatement on our part. This will lead to the Civil War. Just wait. And again, part of the 1850 Compromise, you have an act to suppress the slave trade in the District of Columbia. And so this act prohibited the buying and selling of enslaved people within the District of Columbia, ending the capital's role as a major domestic slave market. However, the law did not abolish slavery in the district, and enslaved people could still be held there and transferred through inheritance or private arrangements. The measure was adopted as a concession to Northern anti-slavery sentiment during the sectional crisis, while Southern leaders accepted it as part of the broader compromise that included the strengthened Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Although limited in scope, the act symbolically reinforced the growing divide over slavery by placing restrictions on the institution in the nation's capital. So again, it's kind of weird how the Southerners are like, oh, the federal government doesn't have a right to outlaw slavery because it's a violation of our equal rights. And then they agree to this compromise, which outlaws the slave trade. So it's not treating the institution of slavery equally at the same time. So, I mean, that's why they call it a compromise, because you have to compromise on some of your values. And so, because of Utah being a new recognized and organized territory, Fillmore, who is president of the United States, will name Brigham Young president of the Mormon Church, governor of the territory of Utah. Young, the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, had led thousands of Mormon settlers westward to the Great Salt Lake Valley after years of persecution in the eastern United States. His appointment reflected the federal government's effort to establish civil authority in a newly organized territory while accommodating the large Mormon population that had settled there. As governor, Young oversaw the creation of Utah's territorial government, though tensions later developed between federal officials and Mormon leaders over issues including religious authority, local governance, and the practice of polygamy, contributing to the later Utah War. Here is one of the first responses to the Compromise of 1850. This is a speech by Jermaine Logan. He is a fugitive slave, and he will focus on the Fugitive Slave Act, and he is speaking in Syracuse, New York, and I made a video of myself reading the full speech if you want to listen to it. The Position and Course of the South by William Trescott. A defense of the Southern social order in response to the sectional crisis surrounding the Compromise of 1850. The object of these pages is, therefore, simply to ascertain what is the position of the South and what course of action it behooves us to follow in the discharge of our duties as a slave-holding people. And so William Trescott maintains that slavery was not merely a regional institution, but the foundation of Southern civilization. providing social stability, economic prosperity, and political independence. Trescott devoted considerable attention to the relationship between labor and capital. Rejecting the emerging Northern ideal of free labor, he argued that every society required labor to remain subordinate to capital, and that social order depended upon a permanent class of laborers directed by those who possessed property and wealth. In his view, slavery represented the most stable and humane solution to this relationship because it permanently united labor with capital while avoiding the class conflict, labor unrest, and economic insecurity he believed characterized free labor societies. The pamphlet became one of the most influential Southern defenses of slavery as both a constitutional right and a positive social and economic system in the years preceding secession. So, he is not only advocating that the institution of slavery is a tradition and is an economic dependence of the South, he is now arguing, and many more Southerners will argue, that slavery is actually perfectly natural and a good rather than a necessary evil. And so you'll have this debate between free labor, which is when the worker has a right to determine his own employment by, quitting, finding, moving, being very mobile, moving, even though he still needs to work, there's still that market demand or a market incentive for people to work, which might be a coercive thing. But you have that kind of free labor versus slave labor, where the laborers did not have a say on what they did, how much they worked, how often they worked, how hard they worked, what they were producing, or anything like that. They couldn't decide who their masters are. Unlike with free labor, the laborers are able to be very mobile and can change their masters, their employers, on their own terms. Also in 1850, you have the first National Women's Rights Convention, held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1850, brought together activists who demand legal, social, and political equality for women, building on the momentum of the earlier 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. Delegates discussed issues such as property rights, education, and suffrage, marking a significant early step in the organized women's rights movement in the United States. So the Seneca Falls Convention 2 years prior was simply to build awareness and support, while this convention was the first official convention where they talked about specific laws and how they're going to achieve their goals. You have the 1850 State of the Union Address by Fillmore, where he promotes the Compromise of 1850 as a positive good that needs to be obeyed. You have Maryland, who will write a report on the Compromise, and the report argued that the Compromise represented a fair adjustment between the interests of the free and slave states and urged all sections of the country to accept its provisions in good faith. Maryland's legislatures particularly emphasized the importance of enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act as a constitutional obligation, while rejecting both Northern nullification and Southern secession as threats to the Union, reflecting Maryland's position as a border state. The report advocated moderation, fidelity to the Constitution, and preservation of the Union through adherence to the compromise measures. So you have deep Southerners, the fire eaters, who are advocating for secession. You have the border states who are in favor of slavery, like Maryland. And then you have the North. Some states in the North, like the Northwest, will be in favor of popular sovereignty, while the Northeast, New England, will be opposed to the compromise altogether. Here is Fillmore's message on Texas. Fillmore informed Congress that Texas had accepted the terms of the compromise, agreeing to relinquish its disputed claims to portions of present-day New Mexico in exchange for $10 million in federal compensation to retire its public debt. You have the Shadrach Minkins escape incident, where an escaped slave from Virginia became the first person arrested in Massachusetts under the Fugitive Slave Act. Minkins was rescued by a group of black men, and an abolitionist network transported him to Montreal, Canada. And so the very first person arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act was rescued and then freed by going to Canada using the Underground Railroad. So this very first instance will anger the South. This, along with many instances of the North helping escaped fugitive slaves rather than returning them to their masters. Fillmore's proclamation on enforcing the Fugitive Act in Massachusetts. This is Fillmore reacting to the Shadrach Minkins incident, where he calls upon the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. Here's another address, but this time to Congress, about the same thing. Fillmore's proclamation of Lopez's invasion of Cuba. So, Narciso Lopez, he invades Cuba. He's a filibuster, and he will be denounced not only by Zachary Taylor, the president at the start of this section, but now by Millard Fillmore as well. Sojourner Truth will give a speech called Ain't I a Woman at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron. And so this speech is her confronting racial and gender inequality, specifically racial inequality in the women's rights movement. The first chapter of Uncle Tom's Cabin is published. It began as a serial, and it will later be published as a full book. And I'll talk more about the details when I talk about the book. Fillmore lays the cornerstone of the extension of the Capitol. And so this is more or less what the Capitol looks like today, the Capitol building. And that current building began its construction on July 4th, 1851. Gold is discovered along the Rogue River in Oregon, and so this will encourage more people to move to the Northwest. The execution of Narciso Lopez. Lopez had led several filibustering expeditions for the United States in an effort to liberate Cuba from the Spanish Empire, with the expectation that the island might ultimately be annexed by the United States as a slave state. After landing in Cuba in August of 1851, his force was quickly defeated by Spanish troops, and Lopez was captured and sentenced to death. His execution ended the expedition, but intensified American interest in Cuba, making Lopez a martyr to many Southern expansionists, while reinforcing the Fillmore administration's opposition to unauthorized military expeditions against foreign nations. And so this will not be the last that we see of the filibusters. You have Jerry's rescue. A fugitive named Jerry is arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act. Abolitionists, including Logan's allies, that's Jermaine Logan in Syracuse, New York, storm the jail in Syracuse, free him, and help him escape to Canada. Logan's home and network are crucial parts of the Underground Railroad in this period. Fillmore's proclamation on the incursions in Mexico. And so, again, the filibustering is not over. You have a new leader of the filibusters, if you can call him that, which is William Walker. And so he is trying to take parts of Mexico. You have Fillmore's 1851 State of the Union. He's still talking about how the Compromise of 1850 is the best, final settlement of slavery controversy, urging all Americans to uphold it in good faith. And this will not end well for the Union. The Compromise of 1850 does not end well, since pretty much all sides don't like the Compromise. And so this is an act in relation to service. Utah legalizes slavery in the territory of Utah. So it's not yet a state, but it is an organized territory. And they, in 1852, will legalize slavery. You have the publishing of the full book of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And this is written in response to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The novel vividly portrayed the cruelty of slavery through the lives of enslaved families, particularly Uncle Tom, Eliza, and George Harris. It became an immediate bestseller, selling more than 300,000 copies in the United States during its first year and reaching millions more through foreign editions and theatrical adaptations. The book influenced public opinion in the North by strengthening the abolitionist movement while outraging many Southern defenders of slavery. It became one of the most influential American works of the 19th century. The resolution and ordinance of the State Convention of South Carolina. So, meeting in response to the Compromise of 1850, the convention declared that South Carolina regarded the Compromise, particularly any failure to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, as a serious threat to Southern rights. Although many delegates favored disunion, the convention ultimately resolved to remain in the Union so long as the Compromise was faithfully executed, while warning that continued Northern resistance or future restrictions on slavery would justify secession. The ordinance reflected South Carolina's growing commitment to states' rights and disunion, foreshadowing its eventual secession in 1860. So this is all the way back in 1852. States are talking about secession. You have the Whig Party platform of 1852. And this will start to split up the Whig Party, where the Whig Party adopted its national platform at the party's convention in Baltimore, nominating Winfield Scott for president. The platform endorsed the Compromise of 1850 as a final settlement of the slavery controversy and pledged to uphold every provision of the Compromise, including the controversial Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. By embracing the Compromise, the Whigs sought to preserve national unity and appeal to both Northern and Southern voters. Excuse me. But the platform exposed deep sectional divisions within the party. Many anti-slavery Whigs rejected its support for the Fugitive Slave Act, contributing to the party's rapid decline and eventual collapse later in the decade, as those anti-slavery Whigs will form their own party, the Republican Party. So now the Whig Party is breaking up, and soon you'll see the Democratic Party breaks up, all over the issue of slavery. Henry Clay, one of the great compromisers, or the triumvirate of Congress, dies on June 29th, 1852. You have two very impressive speeches. One is called Hypocrisy of American Slavery by Frederick Douglass. This was given on July 4th, 1852, where he condemned the contradiction between the nation's celebration of liberty and the continued existence of slavery. Douglass praised the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the ideals of the American Revolution, while arguing that slavery represented a betrayal of the nation's founding promises of equality and natural rights. He denounced the political and religious defenses of slavery, criticized the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, and argued that the nation's prosperity and democratic institutions were corrupted by the oppression of millions of enslaved people. The speech became one of Douglass's most powerful indictments of slavery. exposing what he viewed as the moral hypocrisy of a republic that proclaimed freedom while denying it to a large portion of its population. And then the next day, you have a little bit more famous speech by Frederick Douglass, that is, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July?" This was actually given on July 5th, while the other speech was given on July 4th. So don't confuse the timelines, even though this one is about the July 4th. It wasn't given on July 4th. And so this one expanded what he talked about yesterday, and it was given before Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society in Rochester, New York. Douglass used the nation's celebration of independence as a lens through which to expose the contradiction between America's founding ideals of liberty and the continued existence of slavery. In the speech, Douglass praised the courage of the founding generations and the principles of the Declaration of Independence, but argued that the celebration of freedom was a source of grief and condemnation for enslaved Americans who remained denied of those same rights. He attacked the moral and religious justifications of slavery, condemning the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and argued that slavery corrupted the nation's democratic institutions. Douglass declared that the 4th of July revealed the distance between America's professed ideals and its actual practices, challenging the nation to fulfill the promises of liberty and equality contained in its founding documents. The address became one of the most influential abolitionist speeches in American history and a defining critique of slavery's incompatibility with Republican government. Whew. A lot to say there. Here's a speech by Charles Sumner, Freedom National, Slavery Sectional. Charles Sumner delivered his first major speech in the Senate, called Freedom National, Slavery Sectional, calling for the repeal of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Sumner argued that the act violated the Constitution, denied alleged fugitives fundamental rights such as trial by jury and due process, and compelled free citizens to participate in the enforcement of slavery, rejecting the view that the Compromise of 1850 represented a final settlement of the slavery question. Sumner contended that slavery existed only by local state law, while freedom was the governing principle of the federal government. He urged Congress to repeal the Fugitive Slave Act as both a constitutional necessity and a moral obligation, establishing himself as one of the Senate's leading anti-slavery voices and helping to define the emerging Free Soil and later Republican constitutional argument against the expansion and federal protection of slavery. Daniel Webster will die. So now the entire triumvirate, all three members who were crucial in creating and maintaining the antebellum compromise system, are now dead, and they die at a time where compromise is now falling apart. And so I find that interesting how the generation that created the compromise system dies, and the next generation that will follow them will destroy the compromise system. Yeah, the election of Pierce. And as you can see here, we have a video by Mr. Beat. This is one of his summaries of the presidential elections. So I definitely encourage you guys to check out his channel, subscribe, watch this video, and if you like his content. And so this is the election of Pierce, and he won over Winfield Scott and John Hale. He is a Democrat. That is Pierce. Fillmore's 1852 State of the Union. Fillmore defended the faithful enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, arguing that respect for the Constitution and the rule of law was essential to preserving slavery, or preserving the Union. Solomon Northup is freed. Solomon Northup regained his freedom after spending nearly 12 years enslaved in Louisiana. a free black man from New York, Northup had been kidnapped in Washington, D.C. in 1841, stripped of his legal identity, and sold into slavery under the name Platt. His release was secured through the efforts of New York attorney Henry B. Northup, who obtained proof of Solomon Northup's free status and persuaded Louisiana authorities to restore his liberty. Later that year, Northup published his memoir, 12 Years a Slave, providing one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of American slavery. The work became an influential abolitionist text exposing the brutality of the slave system and demonstrating that even free African Americans were vulnerable to kidnapping and enslavement under the nation's laws. So this will encourage Northerners to continue not enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, because you have free men who are being captured under the pretense of the Fugitive Slave Act and then brought down back to the South without due process and turned into slaves. So free men are now being turned into slaves, which is a huge no-no for the Northerners, on top of just the existence of slavery, for many Northerners at least. You have the Coinage Act of 1853, which reduced the amount of silver in coins. The act responded to rising silver prices caused by the California gold rush, which had made the bullion value of U.S. silver coins exceed their face value, leading to widespread melting and exportation. By reducing the weight of most silver coins by approximately 7% and limiting their legal tender status for large payments, Congress ensured that the coins would remain in circulation for everyday commerce rather than being treated as bullion. The law effectively shifted the United States towards a de facto gold standard for major monetary transactions while preserving silver as subsidiary coinage, stabilizing the nation's currency and easing the shortage of small denomination coins. And the last document that we have for this section is an act to establish the territorial government of Washington. So this created the Washington Territory that would become Washington State from the northern portion of the Oregon Territory. The new territory included lands north of the Columbia River and north of the 46th parallel, east of the river, encompassed present-day Washington as well as parts of present-day Idaho and Montana. The act established a territorial governor, legislature, and judiciary, extending organized civil government to the rapidly growing Pacific Northwest. So this will conclude this section, Condemned Compromise, which focused on the Compromise of 1850. Now we go into Bleeding Kansas, 1853 to 1857. So the sectional crisis turned openly violent as the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise and imposed popular sovereignty, triggering a rush of settlers, fraudulent elections, and a bitter referendum battle in Kansas that exposed the impossibility of neutrality on slavery. Abroad and at home, expansion intensified the conflict. Filibusters like William Walker attempted to carve out slaveholding empires in Central America, while the Ostend Manifesto revealed the willingness of American leaders to contemplate seizing Cuba for slavery. The political system fractured as abolitionism radicalized. William Lloyd Garrison declared no compromise with slavery, publicly burned the Constitution as a pro-slavery pact. The Republican Party emerged to halt slavery's expansion, and violence erupted with the sack of Lawrence. John Brown's Potawatomi, I'm butchering that, massacre, and the brutal caning of Charles Sumner on the Senate floor. By the end of the Pierce years, the nation stood on the brink of dissolution, as evidenced by gatherings like the State of Disunion Convention, where Northern abolitionists openly debated whether the Union itself had become irredeemably complicit in slavery. So now things are going to get bloody. So you have Pierce's inauguration, where he says that I believe that involuntary servitude, as it exists in different states of this Confederacy, is recognized by the Constitution. I believe that it stands like any other admitted right, and that the states where it exists are entitled to efficient remedies to enforce the constitutional provisions. Vice President William King dies of tuberculosis, and he will not be replaced by anyone. So for most of Pierce's administration, he does not have a vice president. Pierce will go on a speaking tour, and during that speaking tour, he gives a speech at the Crystal Palace expedition in New York City. Pierce delivered an address at the opening of the expedition of the Industry of All Nations held in the New York Crystal Palace. Pierce celebrated the expedition as a symbol of American progress, innovation, and peaceful commerce among nations. He praised the achievements of industry, science, and the mechanical arts, arguing that economic development and international exchange strengthened civilization and prompted peace. The address reflected Pierce's vision of an expanding republic whose prosperity rested on commerce, technological advancement, and the continued development of the nation's resources. William Walker will do his invasion of Mexico in October of 1853. He will invade Baja California and Sonora with a small force of American volunteers to establish an independent republic modeled after the American states, to pretty much repeat what Texas had did decades prior. You carve out a chunk of Mexico, you become an independent republic, and then you later get annexed by the United States. That's pretty much the MO for the filibusters. Although Franklin Pierce will speak out against William Walker. Pierce will give his 1853 State of the Union address, where he talks about how great the nation's going at that time, but also he warned against the sectional crisis and the debate over slavery, and urged Americans to respect the Compromise of 1850. And he also talked about the border conflicts, like with William Walker's invasion of Mexico. Yeah, the Gadsden Purchase Treaty, which bought a lot of land, about 30,000 square miles, for $10 million. And this was to make the border a little bit more stable, and to have the rail line be able to go through that territory on its way to the Pacific. Stephen Douglas will introduce the Kansas-Nebraska Bill. And so Stephen A. Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Bill in the Senate, proposing the organization of the Kansas and Nebraska territories, and allowing settlers to determine the legality of slavery through popular sovereignty. Douglas argued that the bill would promote westward settlement, establish territorial government, and encourage the construction of a transcontinental railroad through the central United States. However, the legislation effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise by allowing slavery to potentially expand into territory where it had previously been prohibited. The proposal ignited intense sectional controversy, as everything seems to ignite the sectional controversy during this time, with many Northerners denouncing it as a concession to the slave power, while many Southerners supported it as a restoration of equal rights for slave-holding states. You have Pierce's proclamation on violence in Mexico, and so Franklin Pierce will talk about William Walker, the filibuster who invaded Baja California and Sonora, and he will denounce it as a violation of America's neutrality to a foreign sovereign nation. Resolution by members of Congress opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska bill. Coalition of anti-slavery members of Congress issued the appeal of the Independent Democrats denouncing Stephen A. Douglas' proposed Kansas-Nebraska Act. Led by figures including Salmon, Portland Chase, and Joshua Reed Giddings, the appeal condemned the bill as a betrayal of the Missouri Compromise and an effort to extend the power of slavery into territories that had long been free. The resolution urged the public to resist the legislation, arguing that repealing the Missouri Compromise would violate a long-standing national settlement, inflame sectional tensions, and threaten the spread of slavery across the Western territories. The appeal helped galvanize Northern opposition to the bill and became a foundational document to the political realignment that soon produced the Republican Party. William Lloyd Garrison will publish a pamphlet called No Compromise with Slavery, which rejected all political and constitutional accommodations with the institution of slavery. Garrison argued that slavery was an irredeemable moral evil that could not be reformed through gradual compromise or balanced sectional agreements, condemning measures such as the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 as corrupt bargains with injustice. Calling upon abolitionists to resist slavery through moral persuasion and uncompromising opposition, Garrison urged Americans to reject any policy that recognized or protected human bondage. Published amid the growing controversy over the proposed Kansas-Nebraska Act, the essay reinforced the abolitionist movement's demand for the immediate and unconditional end of slavery. Stephen Douglas, hearing all this commotion, will amend the Kansas-Nebraska bill. So he's going to revise it and explicitly declaring the Missouri Compromise as inoperative and void, and affirming that the status of slavery, that the status of slavery in the territories would be determined by popular sovereignty. The amendment transformed the bill from a measure organizing Western territories into one of the most controversial pieces of legislation in American history. By opening territory previously closed to slavery, Douglas sought to satisfy Southern Democrats while advancing Western settlement and a central route for a transcontinental railroad. The revised bill provoked fierce Northern opposition, accelerated the collapse of the Whig Party, and laid the foundation for the formation of the Republican Party and the sectional conflicts that culminated in Bleeding Kansas. And so, the Republican Party will be established on March 20th, 1854, and it will be composed of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and Northern Democrats dismayed with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and slavery's potential expansion. Commodore Matthew C. Perry signs the Treaty of Kanagawa, and so this will open up trade with Japan. The New England Immigrant Aid Society is established. Originally the Massachusetts Immigrant Aid Society, the New England Immigrant Aid Company was organized under the leadership of Ellie Thayer, who encouraged anti-slavery settlers to migrate to the newly organized Kansas Territory. Founded in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the company provided financial assistance, transportation, supplies, and town building support to free soil immigrants in an effort to ensure that Kansas entered the Union as a free state under the principle of popular sovereignty. The society played a central role in the struggle over the future of Kansas, helping establish communities such as Lawrence and contributing to the violent conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought for political control of territory. Pierce will veto a land grant, which will grant federal public lands to support insane asylums. And so this will be vetoed by Pierce, argued that the Constitution did not authorize the federal government the power to fund local charitable institutions. Pierce's message on creating a canal in Central America. Pierce delivered a message to Congress discussing the importance of establishing a canal route across Central America. So, again, people are pretty early on talking about the creation of what would become the Panama Canal, although the location hadn't been decided yet. And here is the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It is signed into law on May 30th, 1854, and it organized the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, allowing settlers to determine the legality of slavery through the principle of popular sovereignty. Introduced by Stephen A. Douglas, the act was intended to promote Western settlement, establish territorial governments, and encourage the construction of a transcontinental railroad through the central United States. However, the legislation repealed the restrictions of the Missouri Compromise by declaring that the prohibition of slavery north of the 36th parallel was no longer binding in the new territories. So earlier, I mistakenly said 49th. I meant 36 parallel. Pierce's proclamation against invading Cuba. And so now there's another guy, this time the former Mississippi governor, John Quitman. He is making plans to invade Cuba, and Pierce will speak out against John Quitman, and John Quitman will concede and not invade Cuba. Now, the Sociology for the South, or the Failure of Free Society, by George Fitzhugh, published. This is one of the most influential defenses of slavery in the antebellum South. Fitzhugh rejected free market capitalism and argued that slavery provided greater security and stability than free labor, portraying enslaved people as dependents cared for by their masters. So even the economic arguments are tied to slavery. You have the Anthony Burns Fugitive Affair, where Anthony Burns, an enslaved man who had escaped from Virginia and was living in Boston, was arrested under the authority of the Fugitive Slave Act. His capture was, that's supposed to be one, that's a typo on my part, was one of many confrontations over the enforcement of the law. A group of Boston abolitionists attempted to rescue Burns from federal custody, leading to violent clashes outside the courthouse and the death of Deputy U.S. Marshal James Batchelder. Despite widespread protests and opposition from anti-slavery activists, federal authorities, under the direction of President Pierce, enforced the law, and Burns was returned to Virginia later that month. The event provoked national outrage among many Northerners and became a powerful symbol of the conflict between federal fugitive slave enforcement and the growing abolitionist movement. The Canadian Reciprocity Treaty is signed, which opens the U.S. market to Canada regarding agricultural products, and in return, the United States gets new commercial rights in Canada and the Canadian waters and the Great Lakes. On July 4th, 1854, William Lloyd Garrison will burn a copy of the U.S. Constitution. Garrison's public display burning the U.S. Constitution during an annual meeting of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society in Framingham, Massachusetts, declaring his belief that the federal government and its founding document had failed to uphold moral justice by protecting slavery. Quoting the language of Isaiah, he described the Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, arguing that abolitionists should reject any political compromise with slavery. The demonstration occurred amid intense national controversy over the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, including the recent arrest of the fugitive slave Anthony Burns in Boston. Garrison's symbolic act represented the growing divide between abolitionists who sought immediate emancipation and those who defended the Constitution as a framework capable of preserving liberty. Here is Pierce's veto message on federal funds of public works. So the Democrats at this time, they are opposed to the federal government paying for federal or for public works. These are infrastructure projects. These are improving waterways or constructing roads or stuff like that. And so the Democratic Party, which Pierce is a member of, will be opposed to these things for a while. And they had been since the start of the antebellum era. Here is Lincoln's speech at Pariah. Abraham Lincoln delivered his Pariah speech at after Stephen Douglas had spent several hours defending the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Speaking for nearly 3 hours, Lincoln systematically attacked the act's repeal of the Missouri Compromise, argued that slavery was morally wrong and should not expand into the territories, and maintained that the principles of the Declaration of Independence applied to all people. The exchange served as a precursor to the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates and established Lincoln as one of the nation's leading opponents of the expansion of slavery. So Lincoln and Douglas, they've been friends for a very long time, and they would go to each other's events, and although they disagreed a lot, they would always, share the time at each event to let the other person talk. And so it's an interesting relationship. These people who are of two different parties, Douglas is a Democrat, a Northern Democrat, while Lincoln was originally a Whig and now he's a Republican, and yet they maintain their friendship. Maybe a lesson that we can take today. And they gave each other the time of day to talk and deliberate on these issues that were dividing the nation. They did not let divide their friendship, which is kind of sweet. Here's the Ostend Manifesto. Three diplomats, James Buchanan, who would become president, John Mason, and Pierre Soleil, I know I butchered that, met in Ostend, Belgium, and drafted the manifesto. It argued that Cuba's strategic location and potential for a slave revolt made it essential for the United States to control it. The document controversially suggested that if Spain refused to sell Cuba, the U.S. would be justified in taking it by force. Pierce's 1854 State of the Union, where he will defend the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He will continue to defend the Compromise of 1850. He will talk about the Gadsden Purchase Treaty and the treaty opening up trade with Japan. And he encouraged Americans to uphold the Constitution, preserve the Union, and allow territorial settlers, not Congress, to determine the status of slavery in the territories and new states. Pierre Soleil resigns, U.S. Minister to Spain, and one of the authors of the Ostend Manifesto. Congress and Pierce force him to resign over the backlash of the manifesto. an act guaranteeing U.S. citizenship for those born on foreign soil to American parents. And so this is one of the first acts which will establish a policy called jus sanguinis, jus meaning right, sanguinis meaning of blood. So it's the right of blood, or the right to be a citizen by your blood, by your birth. And so this is being talked about at this time. And the pro-slavery legislature convened in Pawnee, Kansas. The first territorial legislature of Kansas Territory convened in Pawnee after elections widely criticized as fraudulent because thousands of pro-slavery Missourians, known as border ruffians, had crossed into Kansas to vote illegally. Although Governor Andrew Reeder had attempted to limit electoral fraud, the pro-slavery majority quickly asserted control. The legislature soon relocated to the pro-slavery town of Shawnee Mission, where it enacted a strict slave code, criminalized anti-slavery activities, and recognized slavery throughout the territory. Free state settlers rejected the legislature as illegitimate, creating rival institutions that competed in the violent conflict known as Bleeding Kansas. Lincoln's letter to George Robertson on the failures of compromise. And so he's talking about the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the 1850 Compromise, and how all these compromises are dangerous. The Free State forces in Kansas. So anti-slavery settlers gathered in Big Springs, Kansas Territory, to organize resistance against the bogus legislature elected through widespread voter fraud by pro-slavery border ruffians, declaring the legislature that had first convened at Pawnee illegitimate. The delegates formed a Free State movement dedicated to opposing the extension of slavery through lawful political action and, if necessary, self-defense. The Big Springs Convention adopted resolutions rejecting the authority of the pro-slavery territorial government, called for the election of a free state government, and encouraged settlers to unite in defense of free institutions. The meeting marked the formal organization of the Free State movement in Kansas and the other side of the violent conflict known as Bleeding Kansas. William Walker will take Grenada, the capital of Nicaragua. So at first he invades Mexico, gets kicked out, and now he invades Nicaragua, where he has some success. He takes the capital, and he makes himself the local de facto ruler of Nicaragua, which does not last long. You have the Topeka Convention, in response to the pro-slavery territorial government and its illegal political proceedings. The Topeka Convention, written by Free State forces and outlawing slavery, creates a second government in Kansas. So now you have two governments in Kansas, Free State movement and the border ruffians who established a pro-slavery government. You have the Wakarusa fight, where 1,500 border ruffians attack Lawrence, Kansas, only to retreat after finding it defended by Free State forces. Lawrence, originally named Wakarusa, becomes the center of Free State activities after being founded by the Massachusetts Immigrant Aid Society. You have a split House in the House of Representatives when Congress convened for its first session of the new year in December of 1855. The House was split between anti-slavery and pro-slavery. And so it took 2 months and 133 ballots before electing the Speaker of the House, which is the longest Speaker election in U.S. history. Pierce will make a proclamation on violence in Nicaragua, talking about William Walker, of course, and how he is against it. You have the Kansas Topeka Constitution, where the Free State delegates in Kansas Territory submitted the Topeka Constitution, a proposed state constitution created in response to the pro-slavery territorial legislature they considered illegitimate because of fraudulent elections. The document prohibited slavery in Kansas, established a government based on free state principles, and sought admission of Kansas into the Union as a free state. The Topeka Constitution represented the growing divide between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers following the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so now you have two constitutions in Kansas territory, and both will be presented to the federal government for approval. Only one will be approved. Pierce's 1855 State of the Union talks about popular sovereignty, promotes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he condemns the pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups that use violence in places like Canada, and he rejects the Free State Topeka movement as unlawful. So the president, Pierce, is against the anti-slavery constitution, the Topeka Constitution, and he will be in favor of the pro-slavery constitution. He also talks about William Walker in Nicaragua, warning against American citizens participating in unauthorized foreign expeditions. Pierce will officially declare the Topeka Constitution illegitimate, and so he is not in support of the free state movement government. He will be in favor of the pro-slavery Constitution of Kansas. He will talk about it further in his proclamation on violence in Kansas. You have the American Party, the Know Nothing Party platform that you can read and see what they cared about. The American Party adopted its national platform, outlining its positions on immigration, religion, government reform, and national unity. The party, commonly known as the Know Nothings, called for stricter naturalization laws, longer residency requirements before citizenship, and limits on the political influence of recent immigrants, particularly Catholics from Ireland and Germany. The platform emphasized American nationalism, support for Protestant political traditions, opposition to corruption, and preservation of the Union amid growing sectional tensions. On slavery, the party attempted to avoid taking a strong sectional position, instead supporting adherence to existing constitutional compromises and presenting itself as an alternative to the increasingly divided Democrat and Republican parties. The platform reflected the rise of nativist politics during the collapse of the second party system. The Crime Against Kansas by Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner delivered his famous speech, The Crime Against Kansas, on the floor of the Senate, condemning the violence and fraud committed by pro-slavery forces in Kansas Territory. Sumner argued that the Kansas-Nebraska Act had opened the door for the expansion of slavery and accused Southern leaders of conspiring to impose slavery upon Kansas against the will of its settlers. The speech personally attacked pro-slavery senators, particularly Andrew Butler, whom Sumner accused of defending the harlot slavery. So you have the sacking of Lawrence, which happens after the Crime Against Kansas speech on May 21st, 1856. This is when pro-slavery forces and border ruffians raid Lawrence, Kansas, following Judge Samuel D. Lecomte's demand that free state officials be indicted for treason. The pro-slavery forces destroy the Free State Hotel and two of Lawrence's anti-slavery newspapers. So this background image is the sack of Lawrence, even though it's just one building that gets sacked. It's not the entire town. It's just the Free State Hotel. And the following day, Senator Sumner, a Northerner, gets caned by Senator Brooks. Senator Brooks is actually related to the guy that Sumner talked about, Butler, and that on top of the violence happening in Kansas led to Brooks caning Sumner. Yeah, the Potawatomi Massacre by John Brown, along with his 5 sons and some other Free State associates, killed 5 pro-slavery settlers along a creek in Kansas Territory. The attack was carried out in retaliation for pro-slavery violence against Free State settlers, including the sacking of Lawrence. And so this is the start of John Brown's killing phase, which he'll do for the next year. In the Democratic Party platform of 1856, which nominates James Buchanan, the Democratic Party adopted its national platform at the Democratic National Convention and nominated James Buchanan as its presidential candidate. The platform defended the principles of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and popular sovereignty, arguing that settlers in the territories had the right to decide the issue of slavery without congressional interference. The Democrats condemned the emerging Republican Party as a sectional movement and pledged to preserve the Union, enforce federal laws such as the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and support territorial expansion. The platform reflected the party's effort to maintain national unity while defending policies that increasingly divided North and South. You have the American Party, which nominates former President Fillmore. And so they're going to take more of a moderate stance, although still a pro-slavery stance. You have the first Republican National Convention, and they will nominate John C. Fremont. So the newly formed Republican Party had its first national convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and nominated John C. Fremont for president. The party was founded in opposition to the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, particularly in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the violence of Bleeding Kansas. The Republican platform called for the preservation of free labor in the territories, the restriction of slavery's expansion, the support for Western development, including homesteads for settlers. William Dayton was selected as Fremont's vice presidential running mate. The convention marked the rise of a new sectional party that would become the dominant political force in the North, particularly the Northeast. And the Defense of Massachusetts by Anson Burlingame. Anson Burlingame delivered his speech, Defense of Massachusetts, in the House of Representatives, responding to Southern criticisms of Massachusetts following the assault on Charles Sumner by Preston Brooks. Burlingame condemned the attack as an assault on free speech and Northern honor, defending Massachusetts as a leader in liberty and opposition to the expansion of slavery. He argued that the violence in Congress reflected the broader aggression of the slave power and warned that sectional hostility threatened the principles of Republican government. The speech became one of the most prominent Northern responses to the Sumner caning and the growing crisis over slavery. William Walker will become the president of Nicaragua after seizing the capital earlier that year. You have a veto message on infrastructure. So Pierce, a Democrat, will be opposed to infrastructure projects, while Congress at this time is pretty much split, and so his veto message will be overridden, since many people will be in support of infrastructure projects. You have the Battle of Osawatomie. The Battle of Osawatomie was fought in Kansas Territory between approximately 250 pro-slavery border ruffians led by John Williams Reed and about 40 Free State defenders led by John Brown. Brown's forces attempted to defend the Free State settlement of Osawatomie, but were overwhelmed by the larger pro-slavery force. The battle resulted in the destruction and burning of much of the city. That's more like a small town, further escalating the violence of Bleeding Kansas. You have the last Whig convention. So this is the end of the Whig Party. The Whig Party will be no more most of the Whigs will go to the Republican Party, while many will go to the Democratic Party. And so the last Whig convention will be held in September of 1856, and they will nominate Fillmore, who was the former president in the last section before Pierce. If Harriet Tubman helps Tilly escape, one of Tubman's documented rescues involves a woman known as Tilly, whose journey from Baltimore to Philadelphia under Tubman's guidance becomes one of the most celebrated cases of her work. You have the election of Buchanan. Buchanan wins against John C. Fremont and Millard Fillmore. And here's a video by Mr. Beat talking about this election. Yeah, Pierce's 1856 State of the Union, where this is his final annual message to Congress, and he talks about the crisis in Kansas. He talks about national unity. He talks about how illegitimate the Free State Topeka government is, and also his continued support for the compromises of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And he also talks about how he disapproves of William Walker in Nicaragua. You have the State of Disunion Convention. The State of Disunion Convention was held in Worcester, Massachusetts, where abolitionists and anti-slavery activists gathered to discuss the possibility of peacefully separating the free and slave states, supported by the New England Immigrant Aid Company. The convention reflected growing frustrations among radical abolitionists over the federal government's protection of slavery. William Lloyd Garrison addressed the gathering, reaffirming his belief in no union with slaveholders, and arguing that abolitionists should reject political compromises that sustained slavery. The convention represented the most radical wing of the anti-slavery movement, which viewed the Union itself as complicit in slavery, even as most anti-slavery Americans continued to seek reform within the existing constitutional system. You have the Enabling Act of Minnesota in preparation of turning it into a state, a free state. And then you have the Tariff Reduction Act of 1857. So this reduces the import duties from 20 to 15%, but it doesn't come in time for the Panic of 1857. So this concludes the section on Bleeding Kansas, 1853 to 1857, which is the Pierce administration. So now let's go into the third and final section of this chapter, which is called A House Divided, and it covers the Buchanan administration from 1857 to 1860. And so these years were defined by constitutional disintegration, beginning with Dred Scott v. Sanford, which declared that Congress had no power to restrict slavery in the territories that the black Americans were not citizens with rights white men had to respect, provoking fierce responses from abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, who condemned the ruling as morally bankrupt. Economic instability deepened political frustration with the Panic of 1857, while the Lecompton Constitution controversy exposed the fraud of popular sovereignty. Sectional ideologies solidified through rhetoric like James Hammond's "Cotton is King" speech asserting Southern economic supremacy, William Seward's irrepressible conflict framing slavery and freedom as incompatible systems, and Lincoln's "A House Divided" address declaring the Union could not endure permanently half slave and half free. Such themes were visible in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which made the two men national figures. By 1859, 1860, events raced toward irreconcilable conflict, as John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry terrified the South. Mass political mobilization surged with groups like the Wide Awakes, and the election of 1860 became a referendum on the Union itself, making disunion no longer a theory, but an impending reality. Ooh, now we're getting close to the start of the Civil War. And so, the very first document that we include is Buchanan's inaugural address on March 4th, 1857. Buchanan called for national unity, go figure, defended the Constitution, expressed confidence that the controversy over slavery in the territories would soon be settled by the Supreme Court. He's referring, of course, to the Dred Scott decision. He pledged to preserve the Union, ironically, and enforce federal law, believing that judicial resolution would end the sectional conflict that had intensified during the Pierce administration. So he is going to be talking too soon, because pretty much none of what he talks about comes true. So you have the infamous, the worst, this is the absolute worst Supreme Court decision ever. Dred Scott decision. And I have a video here by Mr. Beat. Check out his channel and subscribe. And it's just a summary of the Dred Scott decision, talking about the facts of the case and then what the final decision was. But this Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott v. Sanford, ruling that people of African descent, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens of the United States and therefore could not sue in federal court. Writing for the majority, Roger Brooke Taney further held that Congress lacked the constitutional authority to prohibit slavery in the federal territories, declaring that Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. The decision was celebrated by many Southerners, but condemned throughout much of the North as a sweeping victory for the slave power. Rather than settling the sectional conflict, the ruling intensified national divisions, strengthened the emerging Republican Party, and became one of the most consequential Supreme Court decisions in American history. Whew. Yeah, there's a lot to that Supreme Court decision, and it is a hefty Supreme Court decision. It is very long. So this is continuing from that. You have William Walker arrested by the U.S. Navy, and he will return back to Nicaragua later. You have a speech on the Dred Scott decision by Frederick Douglass. So this is one of the early responses by abolitionists of the Dred Scott decision. Frederick Douglass delivered a speech condemning Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford, rejecting Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney's ruling that black Americans could not be citizens. Douglass argued that the decision was neither morally nor politically final and predicted that public opinion would ultimately overturn it. Douglass urged abolitionists to continue the struggle against slavery, insisting that the Constitution could be interpreted as a document of liberty rather than slavery. His speech became one of the most influential anti-slavery responses to the Dred Scott decision and reinforced his faith that justice would prevail despite the court's ruling. Now you have Lincoln's response to the Dred Scott decision. So Abraham Lincoln delivered his speech in Springfield, Illinois, condemning the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford. Lincoln rejected the court's conclusion that black Americans could not be citizens and argued that Congress retained the authority to restrict slavery in the territories, while acknowledging that the decision was binding on the parties involved. Lincoln maintained that it should not be accepted as a permanent political rule. He defended the principles of the Declaration of Independence and warned that accepting the decision without challenge threatened both free institutions and the future of the nation. At the Panic of 1857, a severe economic downturn triggered by the failure of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company in August, leading to the collapse of banks, businesses, and railroads across the United States. Falling grain prices over expansion of the railroad industry and declining international demand for American exports deepened the financial crisis. The panic struck the industrial North particularly hard, while much of the cotton-dependent South weathered the recession more successfully, reinforcing sectional disagreements over economic policy. The downturn revived demands for higher protective tariffs and intensified political divisions on the eve of the Civil War. You have the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which occurred in southern Utah Territory when a group of Mormon militia members and the Paiute allies attacked the Baker Fancher emigrant wagon train traveling to California. After a siege, the attackers killed approximately 120 men, women, and children, sparing only a few young children. The massacre took place amid rising tensions between the federal government and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints during the Utah War. Local Mormon leaders, including the militia commander John Doyle Lee, played central roles in the attack, though responsibility and the extent of higher leadership involved remained subjects of controversy. You have the sinking of the SS Central America, where $2 million worth of gold sinks off the coast of South Carolina, exacerbating the Panic of 1857. The wreck was found in 1988, and much of the gold has been recovered, which is pretty cool. I mean, it wasn't cool for these guys, but it was cool that we got the gold back. You have the Kansas Constitution. This is the Wyandotte, the anti-slavery constitution. And so delegates at the Wyandotte Constitution Convention drafted a new constitution for the Kansas Territory, replacing the earlier pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. Oof. Say constitution how many times? Let's see. Meeting in Wyandotte, present-day Kansas City, Kansas, Free State delegates created a constitution that prohibited slavery, protected many civil rights, and established a government aligned with the anti-slavery settlers who gained political control in the territory. The Oregon Constitution, which isn't as important as the Kansas one, since this is deep in the Free State territory. Buchanan's 1857 State of the Union address, where he talks about the Panic of 1857, the ongoing violence in Kansas, and the tensions over slavery. He will defend the principles of popular sovereignty and will promote the Lecompton Constitution for Kansas. He would also defend the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott. You have a referendum of the Lecompton Constitution. Kansas Territory held a referendum on the Lecompton Constitution, a pro-slavery constitution drafted by a convention dominated by pro-slavery delegates. The vote allowed settlers to choose between accepting the Constitution with slavery or rejecting slavery while keeping the Constitution's protections for slaveholders. But Free State settlers boycotted the election, arguing that it was illegitimate. The referendum resulted in overwhelming approval of slavery, with 6,226 votes in favor and 569 votes against, though the outcome was widely criticized as fraudulent because thousands of Free State settlers did not participate. The controversy over the Lecompton Constitution deepened divisions within the Democratic Party and led to a major confrontation between President Buchanan and Senator Stephen Douglas over popular sovereignty. This is the act authorizing Treasury notes to alleviate the panic. So this is one of the first times that the federal government got involved, interfering, or maybe not interfering, but trying to alleviate the financial crisis with a additional liquidity into the economy, what would later be developed as the idea of quantitative easing. It's very different today, but this is the first time that the federal government actually did something to alleviate a recession. Buchanan's message submitting the Lecompton Constitution. So Buchanan, he supports the Lecompton Constitution, but Stephen Douglas does not support it because it wasn't decided by the people, because most of the people boycotted the election. You have the Keat-Grow brawl in the House. An infamous floor brawl erupts as members of the U.S. House of Representatives debate the Lecompton Constitution. The fight erupted between South Carolina fire eater Lawrence Kent and Republican abolitionist Galusha Grow, these are pretty interesting names, of Pennsylvania. As members from each side joined the fray, Wisconsin Representative John F. Potter, the Western Hercules, snatched the toupee from atop Mississippi Representative William Barksdale's head, and the House erupted in laughter at the absurdity. "Hooray, boys, I've got his scalp," shouted Potter. So, this a fight breaks out in the House of Representatives at the Capitol. Cotton is King by James Hammond. James Hammond is a South Carolina senator, and he will declare that cotton is king, arguing that Southern cotton economy made the region indispensable to the world and immune to Northern threats. He defended slavery as the foundation of this prosperity, claiming enslaved laborers were better cared for than Northern wage workers. The speech reinforced Southern confidence in slavery's permanence and deepened sectional tensions on the eve of the Civil War. The Senate will approve of the Lecompton Constitution. The U.S. Senate approved a bill admitting Kansas Territory to the Union under the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. This does not get past the House, though, as the House will resubmit the Lecompton Constitution back to Kansas to be voted on by the people. If the people don't vote for it, then the territory will remain a territory and not become a state. Excuse me. You have the proclamation against the Mormon militia. This is during the Utah War. Buchanan will make a proclamation denouncing the activities of the Mormon militia. You have the English Act, which is the compromise over the disputed admission of Kansas Territory under the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. The act offered Kansas immediate statehood with a large federal land grant if voters accepted the Constitution, but required the territory to remain under territorial status if they rejected it. The measure was supported by President Buchanan and Southern Democrats, but opposed by Northern Democrats, by Stephen Douglas and Republicans, who argued that it pressured voters into accepting a pro-slavery constitution. Kansas voters rejected the Lecompton Constitution in August in a referendum, delaying statehood. The admission of Minnesota as the 32nd state, and it will be a free state. Minnesota's constitution. You have the treaty with the Sioux. The several Sioux bands ceded additional lands in Minnesota and the surrounding region to the federal government. The agreement continued the process of indigenous land dispossession as white settlement expanded following Minnesota's admission as a free state. The treaty provided financial payments and other benefits to the Sioux in exchange for territorial concessions, but disputes over payments, treaty obligations, and increasing settler pressure contributed to worsening relations between the Sioux and the United States. These tensions would later contribute to the outbreak of the Dakota War in 1862 during the Civil War. You have the Marais des Cygnes, I am not a French speaker, massacre, where pro-slavery forces led by Charles Hamilton attacked anti-slavery settlers in the place in Kansas, killing 5 men in one of the bloodiest events of the Bleeding Kansas conflict. The massacre intensified national outrage over the violence surrounding slavery and heightened tension that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Now we get to an amazing, amazing speech. This is just one of the best speeches ever in U.S. history. This is a House divided by Abraham Lincoln. Upon accepting the Illinois Republican Party's nomination for U.S. Senate, Abraham Lincoln declared that the nation could not endure permanently half slave and half free. Lincoln warned that the country faced an existential crisis over slavery, framing the sectional conflict as a moral and political struggle that would shape the survival of the Union. So he says, the Union cannot, persist as a half free and half slave society. One has to conquer the other. Which one does he want to conquer the other? He wants the free side to conquer the slave side. Abraham Lincoln was an abolitionist. Stop saying that he wasn't an abolitionist. I don't know why you have historians out there saying that Abraham Lincoln was not advocating for abolition. He absolutely was. What people get confused is when Abraham Lincoln says that he, as president, does not have sole unitary executive authority to just abolish slavery all by himself. All the times where he talks about not abolishing slavery, he's talking in relation to his power as president. And no, the president alone does not have the power to abolish slavery. The only institution in our society that has the power to do something like that is the legislature on the state and federal level when it comes to amending the Constitution. The president by himself does not have the authority to abolish slavery. That does not mean that Abraham Lincoln did not want to abolish slavery. He absolutely did want to abolish slavery. So stop saying that he wasn't an abolitionist. He absolutely was. He's one of the best. To me, he's equal to Washington. Washington and Lincoln are, to me, tied for being the best president of, and I'm leaning more towards Lincoln the more I learn about him. I am leaning more towards Lincoln. But, Washington, he's still, the founder, the father of the country. So he deserves some credit for that. And he sets the precedent for the presidents. And so that also is important. And so to me, Washington, Lincoln, best top two presidents in the country. Here's the Treaty of Tientsin, which is with China, which opened up the trade with China. And this expanded America's interest in East Asia. You have Stephen Douglas's campaign speech in Chicago, where Stephen Douglas delivered a campaign speech in Chicago during his re-election campaign for the U.S. Senate against Abraham Lincoln. Douglas defended his doctrine of popular sovereignty, arguing that the people of each territory had the right to determine their own institutions, including slavery. Douglas criticized the Republican Party as a sectional organization and defended the principles of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The speech helped set the stage for the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates later that summer, where the two candidates debated the expansion of slavery, the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, and the future of the Union. Here's Lincoln's response to Stephen Douglas. So Abraham Lincoln delivered a speech in Chicago responding to Stephen Douglas's campaign address from the previous day. Lincoln criticized Douglas's doctrine of popular sovereignty, arguing that allowing territories to decide the slavery question did not address the moral issue of slavery's expansion. Lincoln argued that the nation could not remain permanently divided between freedom and slavery, and warned that the principles behind the Dred Scott decision threatened to nationalize slavery. The speech helped launch the broader debate between Lincoln and Douglas that culminated in their famous 7 Lincoln-Douglas debates during the 1858 Illinois Senate campaign. We have the referendum in Kansas in August, where the Lecompton, that's the pro-slavery constitution, is rejected by the people of Kansas. Also in August, you have the first Ottawa Lincoln-Douglas debate, and I'm not going to summarize every single one of them. You know what? Yeah, I will. The debate at Ottawa, Illinois focused primarily on the expansion of slavery, popular sovereignty, and the future of the Union. Douglas defended his doctrine of popular sovereignty, arguing that settlers in each territory had the right to decide whether to allow slavery, and criticizing Republicans for opposing the self-government of territories. He also accused Lincoln of seeking racial equality and warned that Republican policies threatened the Union. Lincoln argued that Douglas's position allowed slavery to expand and criticized the idea that a territory could lawfully choose to establish slavery. He emphasized that the nation could not remain permanently divided between slavery and freedom, and challenged Douglas to explain whether the people of a territory could exclude slavery before statehood, a question that became known as the Freeport Doctrine in a later debate. Literally the next debate, which happened at Freeport, Illinois. And so the second debate, this is the Freeport Lincoln-Douglas debate. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas held their second debate in Freeport, Illinois. Lincoln questioned Douglas on whether territories could legally exclude slavery, despite the Dred Scott decision, forcing Douglas to defend his position, which the popular sovereignty position is against the Dred Scott decision, because the Dred Scott is saying that all the territories have to accept slavery, while Stephen Douglas believes that the individual territories can choose. That's what popular sovereignty is. And so this position that Stephen Douglas takes will become known as the Freeport Doctrine, and Lincoln criticized Douglas for contradicting the Supreme Court's decision, while Douglas accused Lincoln of opposing popular sovereignty and threatening sectional harmony. The third Jonesboro-Lincoln-Douglas debate. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas held their third debate in Jonesboro, Illinois. Lincoln argued that slavery's expansion threatened the nation's founding principles, while Douglas defended popular sovereignty and accused Republicans of promoting sectional conflict. Douglas emphasized that each state had the right to determine its own institutions, while Lincoln argued that the nation could not indefinitely accept the spread of slavery. The debate continued the central question of the campaign, whether slavery should be allowed to expand into the Western territories. The fourth Charleston Lincoln-Douglas debate. Lincoln defended his opposition to the expansion of slavery while clarifying that he did not support immediate abolition where slavery already existed. He didn't support it because, as president, or as a senator and later as president, he did not believe he had the power to do all by himself. He would need a constitutional amendment. Douglas defended popular sovereignty, arguing that states and territories should decide the slavery question for themselves. The debate also addressed race, with Douglas accusing Lincoln of supporting racial equality, which Lincoln argued that opposition to slavery's expansion was consistent with preserving the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So a lot of people will look at this and show that, Lincoln does not believe that black people can live in the United States equal to white people. And you have to keep in mind that this is a debate Lincoln's trying to win, and a lot of people are racist, and they don't support the equal treatment. They might be in favor of abolition of slavery, but a lot of them are not in favor of the equal treatment of African Americans. However, if you look back at the response to the Dred Scott decision written by Abraham Lincoln, he argues that black people are citizens deserving of equal rights and should be treated as equal. So what Lincoln says in this debate is most likely what he thinks he needs to say to win. Because in other places, he advocates for the equal treatment of African Americans, and he doesn't really talk outside of something like this about how blacks and whites can't coexist with each other. If he genuinely believed that, then why would he be against the Dred Scott decision? If he genuinely believed that black people could not be fully incorporated as equal citizens into the United States, then wouldn't he be in favor of the Dred Scott decision instead of being opposed to it? I don't know. The Kansas will ratify the anti-slavery constitution. That's the Wyandotte Constitution, while rejecting the Lecompton Constitution. You have the fifth Galesburg-Lincoln-Douglas debate, where Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas held their fifth debate in Galesburg, Illinois. Lincoln argued that the nation's founders had placed slavery on a path toward eventual restriction and criticized Douglas's doctrine of popular sovereignty as allowing slavery to expand. Douglas defended popular sovereignty, arguing that each community had the right to determine its own institutions and accusing Lincoln of promoting sectional division. The debate focused on the meaning of the Founding Fathers' views on slavery and whether the federal government should limit its expansion. At the sixth Quincy Lincoln-Douglas debate, Lincoln criticized Douglas's popular sovereignty doctrine, as he does in every single one of these debates, and argued that the nation could not permanently accept the expansion of slavery while maintaining its founding principles. Douglas defended his position that territories had the right to defend their own institutions and accused Lincoln of promoting sectional hostility. So it's the same debate. The debate focused on slavery's expansion, the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, and whether the federal government had the authority to restrict slavery in the territories. I got the seventh, the Alton Lincoln-Douglas debate. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas held their final debate in Alton, Illinois. Lincoln argued that slavery's expansion threatened the nation's founding ideals and criticized Douglas's popular sovereignty as a means of allowing slavery to spread. Douglas defended the right of states and territories to determine their own institutions and accused Lincoln of seeking racial and sectional conflict. The debate concluded their Senate campaign, which elevated both men to national prominence and intensified the national debate over slavery. Now you have the irrepressible conflict by William Seward. William H. Seward delivered his irrepressible conflict speech in Rochester, New York, arguing that the nation could not permanently continue divided between a free and slave society. Pretty much paraphrasing Abraham Lincoln's House Divided speech, Seward declared that the conflict between slavery and freedom was a fundamental struggle that would eventually determine the nation's future. You have Buchanan's 1858 State of the Union, where he's talking about the same things, addressing the sad state of the economy, which is still going through the recession, or having the aftermath of the recession of 1857, dealing with foreign affairs, like with William Walker. Buchanan defended his administration's support of the Lecompton Constitution and criticized Stephen Douglas for opposing it, and argued that Kansas should be admitted as a state under a legitimate constitutional process, that is, a pro-slavery one. Buchanan also defended the principles of Dred Scott's decision, arguing that the Supreme Court has settled the constitutional status of slavery in the territories. Yikes. Buchanan. One of the worst presidents ever. Speech upon the Foreign Slave Trade by L.W. Spratt. Leonard Withington Spratt delivered his speech upon the foreign slave trade before South Carolina House of Representatives, arguing in favor of reopening the African slave trade. Spratt claimed that slavery was a positive institution and that importing enslaved Africans, would strengthen the South's economy and society. The speech represented the growing radicalism of Southern fire eaters who rejected earlier compromises and sought to expand and defend slavery as a permanent system. You have John Brown's Missouri raid. John Brown led a raid in the Christmas of 1858 to liberate enslaved people. Brown and his followers freed 11 people and killed one, a slave owner named David Cruz, who attempted to resist the attack. The raid intensified sectional tensions, with abolitionists viewing Brown as a liberator and many Southerners portraying him as inciting slave revolt. The admission of Oregon as the 33rd state and a free state. The Southern Commercial Convention. The Southern Commercial Convention met in Vicksburg, Virginia, to discuss the economic interests and future development of the South. Southern Democrats promoted expanded trade, railroad construction, manufacturing, and commercial independence from the North. The convention also reflected growing Southern sectionalism, with many delegates arguing that the South's economy and political interests were being disadvantaged within the Union. Discussions increasingly connected economic development with the defense of the expansion of slavery, reflecting the rising secessionist sentiment among Southern leaders prior to the Civil War. Oof, we're almost done. We got one more year left. You have the Wyandotte Convention convenes. Delegates convened the Wyandotte Constitutional Convention in Wyandotte, Kansas Territory to draft a new constitution for Kansas after the rejection of the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. Dominated by free state delegates, the convention produced an anti-slavery constitution that prohibited slavery and established the framework for state government. Oh my goodness. Almost done. It's been over 2 hours, but we're almost done. You have the dividing line between federal and local authority, popular sovereignty in the territories, written by Stephen Douglas. Douglas argued that the federal government's role was limited to protecting constitutional rights, while territorial settlers should decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. Douglas defended his position after the controversy over the Lecompton Constitution and his break with President Buchanan, arguing that neither Congress nor outside political forces should impose slavery or prohibit it in the territories. You have the Mudsill by Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln delivered his Mudsill speech at the Wisconsin State Fair in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Lincoln criticized the pro-slavery argument made by James Hammond. That's supposed to be Hammond. That's a typo. My fault. That every society required a permanent class of laborers, rejecting the idea that free laborers were destined to remain a lower social class. Lincoln argued that the free labor system allowed workers to improve their condition through education, skill, and economic opportunity, unlike slavery, which permanently tied laborers to servitude. The speech contrasted Northern ideals of upward mobility with the Southern defense of a fixed social hierarchy based on slavery and race. You have the Kansas Constitution, the Wyandotte, where voters finally approve of a anti-slavery constitution, and this will be the constitution approved in 1861 when the state is admitted. You have John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which took place in October of 1859. So John Brown led an armed raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry with a small group of abolitionists. Brown intended to seize weapons, arm enslaved people, and create a base for a wider rebellion against slavery. The raid failed after U.S. Marines, commanded by Robert E. Lee and led by J.E.B. Stuart, for future Confederate generals, Stuart captured Brown. John Brown's last speech prior to his death, his execution. He rejected the charges against him as unjust and declared that he acted to free enslaved people, not to commit murder or treason. In his statement, Brown expressed confidence in his cause and argued that the nation could only be cleansed of slavery through sacrifice and justice. His words, ending with the belief that he had acted in accordance with divine law, made him a martyr figure among many Northern abolitionists, while increasing fear and outrage among many Southerners. At this time, we also have the publication of the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, which revolutionized biology and how we understand the evolution of species. And this is happening at the same time as John Brown being executed. So it's interesting how historical events overlap. John Brown's execution happened on December 2nd, 1859, and John Brown was executed by hanging in Charlestown after being convicted for treason against Virginia, murder, and inciting slave insurrection following his Harper's Ferry raid. His execution intensified sectional divisions, with many Northerners honoring him as an abolitionist martyr, while many Southerners viewed him as a symbol of violent abolitionist aggression. I'm almost done. Just this couple, pretty much a year left. Buchanan's 1859 State of the Union. Same thing, talking about the recovery of the economy after the Panic of 1857, John Brown's raid, Dred Scott ruling, pretty similar. You have Who Would Not Be John Brown, written by Lydia Maria Child. And this will popularize the martyr image of John Brown in the North. So John Brown is very much considered a martyr by Northerners. The Alabama Platform. Alabama Democrats adopted the Alabama Platform, declaring that slaveholders had the constitutional right to take enslaved people into the territories and demanding federal protection for slavery's expansion. The platform rejected popular sovereignty as insufficient protection for Southern rights and called for the Democratic Party to uphold a stronger pro-slavery position. It reflected the growing radicalism of Southern Democrats and contributed to the party's split at the 1860 DNC. The Alabama resolution to hold a secession convention if a Republican won the election. The Alabama legislature adopted a resolution declaring that if a Republican candidate won the presidential election, Alabama will hold a convention to discuss secession from the Union. The resolution reflected growing Southern fears that a Republican victory threatened slavery and Southern rights. Southern rights to what? To have white supremacy and slavery, of course. Those are the cornerstone of the Confederacy, after all. You have Lincoln's Cooper Union speech on the Republican platform. And so, in this speech, he defends the Republican Party's platform that slavery should not expand into the territories. Lincoln argued that the Founding Fathers had consistently supported restricting slavery's expansion and rejected claims that Republicans threatened Southern rights. The State of the Country, an address by William Seward to the U.S. Senate, addressing the growing sectional crisis over slavery. Seward argued that the conflict between freedom and slavery was deepening and urged the nation to oppose the expansion of slavery while preserving the Union. Jefferson Davis will reply to Seward by saying that Davis is defending the constitutional rights of slaveholders and argued that slavery was protected by the Constitution and federal law. Davis rejected Republican opposition to slavery's expansion, claiming that restricting slavery in the territories violated Southern equality with the rest of the Union. All poor, poor South. Poor, poor South. They don't have the right to bring their slaves to the territories. What a shame. So Jefferson Davis complaining about C-word, complaining about the Southern Democrats, complaining about not being able to bring their slaves to the territories. You have the Wide Awake organization established, and it was formed in Hartford, Connecticut by 5 young Republican supporters and law clerks who sought to organize voters for the upcoming presidential election. The group developed into a nationwide Republican political organization. Excuse me. Known for its nighttime marches, uniforms, and support for Abraham Lincoln. The Wide Awakes promoted Republican candidates, opposed the expansion of slavery, and helped mobilize Northern voters during the 1860 campaign. Now, the House Committee formed to investigate corruption claims on Buchanan. The committee examined claims involving federal contracts, political favoritism, and misuse of executive power. The investigation, led by Republicans and anti-administration Democrats, further damaged Buchanan's reputation and highlighted the political divisions surrounding his presidency. The committee investigation concludes in June with no charges. You have Lincoln's rail splitter speech. Lincoln delivered a speech in New Haven, Connecticut, emphasizing his background as a laborer and his belief in the free labor system. Lincoln used his reputation as a former rail splitter to argue that ordinary workers could improve their condition through effort, education, and opportunity. The speech contrasted free labor with slavery, rejecting the idea of a permanent laboring class and reinforcing Lincoln's Republican message of economic mobility and opposition to the expansion of slavery into the territories. You have the American Constitution and the Slave by Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass is in Glasgow, Scotland, and he is arguing in this speech and in this speech, which both of these speeches happen on the same day, that the Constitution is a liberty-loving document, that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the founding documents of America are actually pro-freedom and will support an anti-slavery platform and ideology. The DNC will fall apart in April of 1860, where the Democratic Party held its national convention in Charleston, South Carolina, but failed to nominate a presidential candidate due to sectional divisions over slavery in the territories. Southern Democrats demanded a platform protecting slavery's expansion into the territories, while Northern Democrats, led by Stephen Douglas, supported popular sovereignty. After repeated deadlocks, the convention adjourned and later reconvened in Baltimore, where the party split into Northern and Southern factions, nominating Douglas and John Breckinridge, respectively. You have Yancey's speech to the National Democratic Convention. William Yancey delivered a speech at the DNC in Charleston, South Carolina, defending the Southern position on slavery. Yancey argued that the Democratic Party must adopt a platform recognizing the constitutional right of slaveholders to take slavery into the territories and demanding federal protection for slavery's expansion. His speech represented the demands of Southern fire eaters and contributed to the sectional split that divided the Democratic Party. You have the Constitutional Union Party platform and nominates John Bell for president. So the Constitutional Union Party is a moderate border state area party where their main thing is maintaining the Union. Because they know if the Union breaks up, there will be war. And if there's war, most of the fighting is going to be in the border states, which they are the border states, and they don't want that. And so the Constitutional Union Party held its national convention in Baltimore, Maryland, adopting a platform centered around the Constitution of the country, the Union of the States, and the enforcement of the laws. The party avoided taking a direct position on slavery and sought to preserve the Union by appealing to former Whigs, Know-Nothings, and moderate voters. The convention nominated John Bell of Tennessee for president and Edward Everett for vice president. You have the 1860 Republican Party platform, and this party platform adopted, the Republican Party adopted its platform at the National Convention in Chicago, Illinois. The platform opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories, supported free labor, and called for policies such as the Homestead Law. Protective tariffs, and internal improvements. The platform affirmed that slavery was a local institution, protected where it already existed, but rejected efforts to extend it into federal territories. Then you have the RNC, which nominates Abraham Lincoln for president, and he will support the platform. A leading contender was William Seward, but Lincoln takes it because he's seen as more of a moderate. And the convention will nominate Hannibal Hamlin for vice president. Lincoln's address accepting the nomination, he's just saying that he's going to uphold the platform of the party. And while the election cycle is going on, you have the census, which happens. And so the 1860 census is done, and although it won't be published until 1861, and so I have a video by Jeffrey the Librarian. If you want to check out his channel and watch this video, you can. And you can watch it either on his channel on YouTube, or you can watch it right here on the timeline itself. You have the Northern Democrats, which nominate Stephen Douglas for president. And so they will also convene in Baltimore, along with the other three parties. Southern Democrats and the Constitutional Union Party, while the Republican Party is the only one to be in Chicago, Illinois. And so they nominate Stephen Douglas for president, and they will adopt a platform supporting proper sovereignty, while the convention initially chose Benjamin Fitzpatrick for vice president. After he declined, the nomination went to Herzl Vespasian Johnson of Georgia. The veto of Homestead Bill. So Buchanan will veto the Homestead Bill, which would have granted 160 acres of western public land to settlers who improved and occupied the land for a specified period. This will be passed under the Lincoln administration. I'll talk about that tomorrow. You have the Southern Democrats. They nominate John Breckinridge for president. And so they're going to have a much more hardline approach when it comes to the issue of slavery, because they're going to be in favor of protecting slavery. So they actually reject proper sovereignty. Southern Democrats do not like proper sovereignty because it gives the people a chance to abolish slavery within the territory or new state. And the Southerners don't want that. Southerners want slavery to expand. And they nominate Joseph Lane for vice president. The wide awake event turns into a brawl in Stones Prairie, Illinois. 7,000 wide awakes meet to hear speakers. Some Democrats show up thinking it was a debate and start heckling the speakers. A brawl breaks out involving hundreds of people. You have the final execution of William Walker, and he's one of the last filibusters, and he's executed by the Honduran military for filibusterism and piracy. And in his defense, he argued that piracy couldn't be committed on land, and that filibusterism wasn't a real word. He was shot. Now you have Yancey's speech on the secession crisis. I love this speech. because it's a very funny speech. I mean, it's very serious for the time, but in retrospect, it's very funny. So at the beginning of the speech, he argues that, slavery is a part of the problem. It's an issue. It's not the whole issue. It's one of three main issues: slavery, the Union, and finance. Those are the three unions over the umbrella issue of a constitutional crisis. So the main thing is the constitutional crisis, and then you have these three issues below that. Well, later in the speech, he does a complete 180. He rejects the finance issue. He says that the South doesn't care about dollars and cents. He only cares about its honor. So that kind of contradicts the whole tariff issue that the South is bringing up. So the Yancey is saying, oh, the South doesn't actually care about money. Money's not the issue. It's about the constitutional crisis. And then later in the speech, he defines what the constitutional crisis is. And he defines it as, and I have it right here, arguing that the federal government had been perverted from its original compact into an instrument of northern domination hostile to southern honor. He contends that the Constitution, properly understood, is, and I quote, is based upon a recognition of Negroes as an inferior race, that is based upon the recognition of property in slaves, that is based upon its recognition as a state institution, based upon its recognition as property, which requires that property to be delivered up by hostile states into which it may become fugitive. So the North is not recognizing these things. It's not recognizing white supremacy. It's not recognizing slavery as proper property. And it's not recognizing the return of fugitive slaves. So William Yancey, a Southerner, a fire eater, a leader of the Confederacy, once secession happens, is saying that the constitutional crisis that everyone's talking about is based on white supremacy and slavery. And those two things just so happen to be what Stephen Douglas will say, Alexander Stephens, not Stephen Douglas. Alexander Stephens will say that the cornerstone of the Confederacy is white supremacy, slavery. Those two things are the cornerstone of the supremacy. So it's not just Alexander Stephens making that argument, it's other fire eaters who will become leaders in the Confederacy when secession happens, like William Yancey. So I highly encourage you guys to read this document. And for all the primary sources that we have on the timeline, you can click on the Read Document button, and at the end of each description, and it will take you to the full page with the text, the full text of the primary source. So I like to see if I can find an image of the document. So the text is published in newspapers at the time. This is the Richmond Enquirer, September 25th, 1860. And then you can download the actual newspaper PDF. And then you have the short little annotation that I wrote, an image of the author, and then a transcription of where I found the primary source, or a citation of where I found the primary source. So this is what a document page will look like, where you have the full text and then little side information. Try to find an image for each of the documents and whatnot. So that's what you see when you click on the Read Document button. Yeah, the Wide Awakes, they will march in the North. Tens of thousands of members of the Wide Awakes, a youth-led, uniformed Republican marching organization paraded by torchlight in cities including New York, Chicago, Hartford, and Annapolis to rally support for Abraham Lincoln's presidential campaign. The Wide Awakes, largely composed of young clerks, artisans, and middle class Northerners, marched to promote union, free labor, and opposition to the expansion of slavery, embodying a new spirit of disciplined mass political organization. Their visibility and enthusiasm helped galvanize Northern voters for Lincoln, but their militarized image also alarmed Southern observers, convincing many in the Deep South that the Republican victory signaled an imminent threat to slavery, thus hastening the secession crisis that followed his election. Yeah, the doom of slavery in the Union. Its safety out of it. John Townsend. John Townsend, a South Carolina planter, political writer, and secessionist, advocate, a fire eater, published The Doom of Slavery in the Union, Its Safety Out of It, arguing that slavery could no longer be secure within the United States. Townsend claimed that Republican opposition to slavery's expansion threatened the institution's future, and argued that Southern independence through secession was necessary to protect slavery. The work reflected the growing secessionist sentiment in the South during the final weeks before the 1860 election. And now we get to the very last event, the very last thing in this chapter, which is the election of 1860, which took place on November 6, 1860. And Lincoln, it's a four-way race, and Lincoln wins. He defeats Stephen Douglas, who is a Northern Democrat, John Breckinridge, who is a Southern Democrat, and John Bell, who is a Constitutional Union candidate. So Lincoln wins, plurality, and he will become the President of the United States. It is crazy. Man, we have finally gotten through this chapter. It only took 2.5 hours, which is an hour less than the, chapter 4, Join or Die. That's simply because that's my favorite chapter, and I have so much to talk about when it comes to the lead up to the American Revolution. But so this chapter, chapter 12, talked about the sectional crisis, the 12 years leading up to the American Revolution. Pretty similar to chapter 4, Join or Die, which is 12 years leading up to the American Revolutionary War. So I think that's just a coincidence that they're both 12 years long. And so this chapter 12 of the compendium is the first chapter of the Emancipation era. Second chapter of the Emancipation era, chapter 13, is going to be on Civil War, which I'm going to be talking about tomorrow. So stay tuned for that, and I'll hopefully have a guest speaker for that. We'll see. I was supposed to have a guest speaker for today. It didn't work out, sadly. But so thank you so much for watching. And I hope that you support our charity. Check out our website, which has this resource. It's completely free for you guys to use. There's no ads. There's no special permission needed for the compendium, which is this resource that I've been showing you during these live streams. There's no, paywall or anything like that. But if you do want to financially support us, you can. We are a 501c3, an educational nonprofit, and so all donations are tax deductible. And I hope you consider it, and I hope to see you tomorrow on tomorrow's live stream. Please send a comment and let me know what you guys think about this resource. Does it help you learn new things about our old past? And if there's anything missing, let me know. I'm always looking to add more to it. So thank you again for watching. I hope to see you tomorrow, and have a nice day.